So thank you all for coming. I'm Michal Perlman. I'm an associate professor here at OISE in the Department of Human Development and Applied Psychology. And as you know, we're going to be talking about monitoring quality in early childhood education and care programs today. But before launching into that, I want to thank the foundations that made this conference possible, that enabled us to bring two guest speakers in and so on. And that's the Atkinson Foundation, the Lawson Foundation, and the Margaret McCain Foundation. I'm going to give a brief overview of sort of the logic and the hows and the whys of monitoring quality in early childhood education programs. Peter Vermuza, formerly of the City of Toronto, is then going to talk about the way that the city's been monitoring quality in these programs for decades. Krista Japel from the University of Montreal will then speak about some of the lessons learned in Quebec following a big policy initiative about monitoring quality, about how to push continuously for quality improvements. And then Deborah Phillips will talk to us about some examples from the US and about Tulsa in particular, where there was a shift to a universal pre-K program that she's been involved in monitoring. I think this meeting was timely from the beginning, from the time that Charles's report was released, but it's especially so, I think, given the announcements made last week that the responsibility for childcare is going to move from the Ministry of Children and Youth Services to the Ministry of Education. Essentially, we've got a big shakeup of the early childhood education system, and that's an opportunity to make sure that we do better, that we have better programs for children, better programs for families over time. But I think central in this is making sure that we understand the quality of the programs and making sure that we use that understanding to push the quality for improvement continuously. The underlying premise for this investment that we're making as a province, and for today's session, of course, is that good early childhood education programs are good for kids and for families. There's a body of literature to support that. Deborah will be speaking to this a little bit later, but that's sort of the background to what I'm going to talk about. The knowledge, the understanding that this is important for our kids as the basic premise. In terms of context, we've got increasing numbers of children attending early childhood education programs, and we've got increased public spending on these programs. And just by way of some background, many of you are probably familiar with this information, thanks to Martha Friendly and others. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen large increases in public spending. It doesn't mean we've got enough, but we're certainly continuing to invest. And the move to full-day junior and senior kindergarten, at the very least, involves a huge price tag. And it will also, it's not just the money, it's the quality of life for thousands and thousands of children and their families, and it's the outcomes for these children over time that we need to think about. Now, just very briefly, I think we need to at least define what we mean by quality, for me to define what I mean by quality. And this is based on both research and theory in early childhood education. And there's a fair amount of consensus that good programs are ones that provide warm and nurturing environments for kids, that provide activities and materials that children can interact with, that allow for active learning, and that have been selected by staff to further specific educational goals, so thoughtful activities for kids to engage with. Good programs provide useful and supportive feedback to children about their performance. They meet the needs of children from diverse backgrounds with different learning needs. They facilitate the connection between home and the early childhood education program. They provide good adult-child ratios and low staff turnover. These aren't just numbers. Those form the basis for the kind of interactions that can take place, the kind of maintaining intimate relationships with the adults around them. That requires that those adults be stable. It's stable in the room. And the programs need to have experienced staff who have training in early childhood education. So this is by no means a comprehensive definition of what quality is. It's a broad one. It's, I think, quite consistent with what's put forward in the Pascal report. It's also one that makes quality very hard to measure. right? It's not like the restaurant ratings where you rate for hygiene and give a restaurant an A, B, or C. We're now looking at things like warmth and responsivity. And when we think about how to monitor that, that certainly poses extra challenges because we have to operationalize or quantify these very subjective things. And that's hard. And I think we have to acknowledge that it's hard, but it's also doable. So what do we know about the current quality of our early childhood education programs? Many of you are probably familiar with the You Bet I Care study. It was a pan-Canadian study that looked at child care centers using the Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale. It's an observational measure. It takes between 3 to 5 hours to administer per classroom, so it's quite intensive. It's on a 7-point scale, and as you can see, the average across Canada was about 4.7. And just to contextualize that, that's a little bit higher than what we see in US samples. It's a lot lower than what we see in sort of the Scandinavian gold standard, if we want to call them that country. So, we have a lot of room for improvement when we see these kind of data. And a second sample, just by way of another example, is one that I was involved in collecting in conjunction with the City of Toronto. And one of the big advantages of this sample was it was randomly selected from the pool of licensed child care centers in Toronto. And that's huge because it allows us to make greater inferences about how representative these data are. And what you can see if you look at the Eckers total column is that it's a little lower than from the findings from the You Bet I Care sample. It's about at the 4 on the Eckers, the same instrument. And I've also put the operating criteria up. The operating criteria is a similar instrument to the Eckers. It's also observational. It's used by the city to monitor quality in the Toronto pool of centers. There are certainly other sources of data, and in fact, Krista will be sharing some data from Quebec, but there really isn't a whole lot. So the reality is, when you think about what do we know about the quality of our programs, not a whole lot. And what we know suggests that there's room for improvement. We can do better, even based on the little that we know. I think we really are in short supply of information about junior and senior kindergarten programs. What I've talked about comes from child care centers, and about programs for infants and toddlers. We really don't know very much about the quality of care they're getting, and the wraparound services piece is unclear. How much we need to worry about that in a moment. And this is, what I've talked about is really brings us to the logic of today's session, which is that we're spending more and more money and we're increasing children's exposure to early childhood education programs. Yet we know very little about the quality of these programs. And we need to know about the quality of these programs so that we can make sure that they're good. We go back to the premise of why we're engaged in this costly, effortful activity. It really, I think, puts the onus on us to understand what the services are. So why this emphasis on understanding quality? I've mentioned quality improvement as a piece of it. I think that in monitoring in this sector, a central piece has to be generating information through the monitoring process that can be fed back into the providers, be they in school, nursery programs, child care centers, whatever the auspice. We need to generate feedback that is useful to that provider so that they can improve. I think accountability is a central piece here. We need greater transparency, as going back to the spending, the public investment in this, and then a public education piece as well. I've surveyed at this point thousands of parents, as have other researchers, and we consistently find that parents are very poor at understanding the quality of programs their kids are receiving. They just don't know. And in an effort to enable them to make the best decisions they can make, and in an effort to move towards a more transparent system, I think we need to give them some tools and give them some information about that system. Monitoring can serve that purpose as well. So it really serves multiple purposes. This is the sort of the restaurant example I mentioned, where I sort of jokingly call this a rate and run kind of model. Great post, and that works in the restaurant sector because there are so many restaurants. I think that in early childhood education that is not the appropriate model. I think we need the ratings, but I think they need to be embedded in a system that then provides support for improvement on an ongoing basis. And this is a sort of complicated looking chart, but really what I was trying to convey is that we've got assessment of quality in the center, and that it interconnects with quality improvement strategies that then feed back into the program, that then would obviously be reflected in the next set of ratings if they're done on an ongoing basis, and that it fits in with its dissemination of the results so that the rating is not done in isolation. It's part of a system geared towards supporting quality over time. There are such systems in place. In the US, there's been, maybe a movement towards implementing these kind of systems. And these data are a little bit out of date at this point from 2004. But at that point, if you look at the dark blue states, they all had a system like this at the state level. I was involved in testing the Colorado system fairly extensively. That movement since 2004 has spread. California's got legislation requiring a quality rating system to be implemented. Florida's well on its way. So there's been a lot of this going on. And in fact, we've been running a system like this, we as in the city, and I turn to Peter, for quite some time in Toronto. And as of a year and a half or so, the scores are posted on the web so parents can use them. And I won't get into that in too much detail because Peter will share more information about this. But it's already in place in Toronto. So what does a system like this, what are the key components of a system like this? And of the measurement in particular? Well, I think fairness is central. Fairness to the provider, fairness to the parents, fairness to the funders, fairness to the children. And fairness means that the measures we use are valid. That means they've been tested so that we know they measure what they purport to measure. And there's a scientific process. To many of you, it may seem like obsessive compulsive, detail-oriented, but this is the only way that we can know that we're measuring what we want to measure. And really that means not using instruments that were sort of developed internally. It means using measures that have been tested and are known to be valid. And the other piece is reliability. That means that across observers, the instruments are used in the same way, so across people, across time, and across location. So if you think about that magnifying glass in the slide as the measure, we need to know that everybody's using it in exactly the same way, that they're seeing what is actually there, rather than what's driven by their own life histories, their experiences, their own personal biases. And there's a process to do this. It's time-consuming, it's rigorous, but it has to be followed in order for us to know that we're capturing what we want to capture, and that we're using our valid measures appropriately. I think another piece is that we need an observational component for this. I think that's the way we get the kind of data that we want for rich feedback. It's also necessary to avoid self-presentation bias. So if we rely on self-report data for this kind of monitoring activity, we open ourselves up for all sorts of biases that are, by well-intentioned, well-meaning individuals, but you can't really rely on self-reports. People don't know, they're biased to present themselves in the best positive light, and so on. So we need some objective measure and observed measurement as part of the assessment strategy. And lastly, it has to be efficient. These kind of systems are costly to administer, and we have to be very careful to minimize those costs. It's not going to be cheap, but it can be cheaper. And that's obviously a factor because we're in a resource-constrained reality, and we want as much of the funds available to go into the programs rather than to monitoring them. I think to achieve these standards, in keeping with Charles's introduction, we need to do this in an evidence-based way. We need to use empirically tested measures. We need to do it in a systematic way. And there are already existing measures that we can use to do this, and I'm going to outline a few of them. I think these are really of the ones that are available, the ones that I recommend for use, and they have different advantages and disadvantages, each of them. The first listed there is the operating criteria. That's the measure that the city has been using for some time, and that I was involved in helping them validate the the instrument. We're still in the process of doing that right now, but it looks very promising. It relates to other measures of quality in the way one would hope and expect. One of the advantages of the operating criteria is it takes an hour per classroom to administer, unlike the ECHRs that I mentioned, it takes 3 to 5 hours. And yet it correlates to the ECHR with about 0.5 level, so that's fairly high. And so that's a big advantage. The classroom assessment scoring system is a really nice instrument in that it generates very qualitatively interesting feedback about the kind of things I was mentioning. We're talking about the definition of quality, the quality of feedback to the kids, the emotional tone of the classroom. So it's a really nice instrument, but it takes 3 hours per room, and it's hard to train on. So, you know, it's again that kind of trade-off. It gives nice feedback about the room, but it's hard to do. Certainly hard to do on you know, I think as an initial feedback piece, it might be useful, but thinking about it in a long-term strategy, that strikes me as not viable just because of the level of effort involved. The caregiver interaction scale, many of you may be familiar with it. It looks at kind of global interaction style of staff with the kids. The appeal of that measure for me is that it takes very little time to complete, but the person completing it has to have been in the room for a minimum of 45 minutes. Now, Charles mentioned that we need to think about the entire system, not just junior and senior kindergarten kids. That strikes me as something that individuals involved in licensing childcare could add to their roster of the information they collect. People can be trained on this. And for another 5 minutes, you know, with an addition of 5 minutes, they can get really interesting qualitative data. And I think that as the responsibility for licensing is shifted, we really need to think about what else can be gathered in a systematic way that's useful about those services for the 0 to 3.8, the prior to school, and that may be something to think about. And then there's the ratios in staff training and education that we always are interested in. You know, they're less proximal, they impact kids less directly in the sense that they likely work through the processes that are captured by these other measures that I mentioned. So who should be assessed? I think we need to stop paying attention to auspice. I think that whether a child is in a child care center that's serving 3 to 5-year-olds, whether they are in a school-based program, whether they're in a nursery school, the standards should be the same. I keep going back to what supports a 4-year-old's development is the same regardless of the setting that they're in. And I think we really need to move beyond type of setting and apply the same standards. I think we need to do this on an ongoing basis. This is somewhere where really, to my knowledge, there's not data that indicates how frequently we need to assess. I think we need to collect some of that data, and we certainly have models to draw from. The city assesses annually. Other QRS systems in the US, sometimes they have staggered. Every 3rd year they assess full and kind of partial assessments along the way. But it has to be on an ongoing basis if we're using it as a tool to leverage quality over time. And I think that, at least for now, it has to be done at the classroom level, again, because we don't know how much the school or the center, how much quality is consistent across rooms. So we need to make these assessments at the classroom level for now. What else? We certainly need to evaluate child outcomes. If we're thinking about understanding the initiative and the change we're undergoing at the moment, I think that goes beyond what we have time for today. We need another session like this just to discuss measuring child outcomes. And it goes back to sort of what are the goals. I mean, I think one of the goals that I've talked about that's central for me is quality improvement over time. Another is understanding this major change we're going through. That's another goal of assessment, and it might look a little bit different. I think there's a third piece, which is just in terms of what's relevant now, just a general knowledge building as we are about to embark on a pretty remarkable naturalistic experiment in Ontario. So some of the barriers is culture, acceptance of monitoring. I think that's certainly going to be a barrier. It is a barrier, but I think we need to break down the silos that are based on precedent and logistics. We're going to have a merging of cultures in terms of early childhood educators and the school system, and it's an opportunity to shake things up and do things a little bit differently. Cost is another factor. Peter will be addressing some of that. I think that while a system like this is going to be costly, it's a fraction of, it's sort of dwarfed by the amount of investment that we're making. So even though it may look high, when you consider it within the context of our spending, it's actually not so big. So just a couple of conclusions. We have a fantastic opportunity to redesign the system. It is being redesigned as we speak. And we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of program quality in the process of this big shakeup. And one example I gave is considering using something like the caregiver interaction scale as part of licensing, so that we get childcare licensing, so that we get more information at relatively small increases in cost. The other piece that I alluded to earlier is that we are embarking on a naturalistic experiment. Because the program, and if you think about the full day piece for a moment, because the program's being rolled out in stages, we are going to have a group of kids who get full day care and a group of kids who get part day care, half day, at the same time. And it's a really unique opportunity to compare those two groups. And I hope and that's a sort of public contribution that goes far beyond Ontario. So in summary, monitoring quality is hard but doable. I think we need to make decisions based on data where it exists, and where it doesn't exist, we need to acknowledge it and collect the data that we need to make informed decisions. And I also think that we don't exist in a vacuum. We need to look outwardly and see what other models we can draw from, who can we learn from. We've got two speakers today that will share some of that information with us. And so on that note, I'm going to turn the mic over to others so that we can see what's already known.